Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar this evening. We are very honored to have you on with us this evening. We do believe that we have a webinar that will be of high interest and will also be very beneficial to you. Before we begin, I would like to just make you aware of a couple of upcoming webinars and some other things that we have going on here at Understanding Ag and the Soil Health Academy. On December the 1st, starting at 7 p.m. Central Time, we're going to feature Burke Teichert in a continuation of our Building Resiliency series. And the topic of Burke's webinar will be Farm and Ranch Profitability, building resilience in those. And then at 7 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, December the 16th, we will be presenting biblical stewardship, what the scriptures tell us about our role as Earth's caretakers. So we invite you to put these two upcoming webinars on your calendar and join us for those. I also want to make you aware that in another few weeks, we will be introducing our Regen Ag Adaptive Grazing online course. This is a course that's going to take a much deeper dive into the foundational principles and practices of adaptive grazing. It's going to follow on the foothills of Regen Ag 101 that we released last December. And as always, remember that we have a host of educational materials and resources available to you on our understandingag.com website and our soilhealthacademy.org websites. So again, welcome this evening to our continuation of our series, Building Resiliency. And tonight's topic is a dive into epigenetics. Epigenetics is something that we have found is profoundly impactful in terms of what happens with every organism out there that we are dealing with that has DNA. That includes the microbes beneath the soil, the plants that feed our livestock and that are our crops, and of course our livestock themselves, and then ultimately us, human beings. So as we dive into epigenetics, I would first like to introduce you to this quote from W.C. Loudermilk from his book, Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years. And Loudermilk states that the land does not lie. It bears a record of what men write on it, a record that is easy to read by those who understand the simple language of the land. So therefore, our management, what we do, is written on the tapestry of the land. So let's talk about the role of epigenetics. And in doing so, I would like to use this quote from George Orwell, where he says, every generation imagines itself to be more intelligent than the one that went before it and wiser than the one that comes after it. This is a basic human condition that we often find ourselves trapped in. And frankly, this is a condition that has caused us to either ignore or greatly misunderstand epigenetics and the profound compounding effect epigenetics can have on our operations and on our individual health. So what is epigenetics? Well, it's defined like this. It's the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the genetic code itself. And to put it in simpler terms, epigenetics is the effect of environmental factors on the degree of gene expression in an organism. So every gene pair that we have in our bodies or that exist in the bodies of our livestock and plants, in macroorganisms and microorganisms, code for something, certain proteins in our bodies. And those proteins cause the traits that we know about to be expressed in a certain manner. When we talk about gene expression, genes can express themselves anywhere from 0% to 100%. And we basically never find a gene expressing itself 0 or 100%. It's always something in between. And to give you a real life example so that you can better understand this, let's think of human eye color. So I have blue eyes. So my genes for eye color code for blue eyes. However, epigenetically, the shade of the blue in my eyes is controlled by environmental factors, both at conception, in utero, and early after birth. So I could have anywhere from pale blue eyes to brilliant blue eyes. And the shade of that color is determined by the epigenetics, those environmental factors that have influenced the degree of expression of my eye color genes. So a few examples of how epigenetics can impact what we do in animal agriculture. By formal training, I'm a geneticist and reproductive physiologist. That's what I did research in when I was with the university, and that's what I taught. I also ran for many years a reproduction clinic where I did quite a bit of embryo transfer work, and I actually did that in depth. So I not only did routine embryo transfer, but I did things like in vitro fertilization, follicular oocyte aspiration, DNA sexing of embryos, and even DNA splitting to artificially create twins. So I did all of that at one point in my life. And what I noticed then was that the embryo calves that we were producing really never quite measured up. You know, they were supposed to be genetically superior. After all, that's why we were doing embryo transfer and in vitro fertilization and, embryo splitting and all of these other things. We thought that we were doing it to much faster advance the genetics and superior genetics of those, what we considered to be superior ancestors or parents. But far more often than not, what I found was that in the advent of doing all of this manipulation from the embryo transfer technologies, that those embryo calves were far less vigorous at birth. Many times they required what almost amounted to a neonatal intensive care to help them get past those early stages of being lethargic and not very vigorous. We also had what was called large calf syndrome. So, these embryo calves, particularly those from further manipulated deals such as the embryo splitting and freezing and thawing of embryos and all of that, often resulted in calves that were much larger birth weight than they normally would have been if they had been naturally sired. So what we now know is all of that was epigenetic effects, that those environmental influences of that manipulation of the sperm and the embryos created DNA damage and significantly altered the actual performance and degree of gene expression in those resulting individuals. And we also know that those impacts can be transgenerational. So those individuals that were produced from these technologies can then transfer those negative compounding epigenetic effects to their offspring and to their grand offspring. And this can be particularly exacerbated in inbred strains or line-bred strains of livestock. Now, epigenetics impacts all of our farm animal species and every crop that we grow, every plant, whether it's a pasture crop or whether it's a cash crop of some type or a feed crop. Epigenetics impacts all of that. And we're going to talk about that tonight and how these epigenetics actually impact them. And basically, epigenetics provides a molecular mechanism of inheritance that is not solely dependent on DNA sequence. And for any of you listening tonight that have had genetics courses in college, or even in high school, you were taught about Mendelian inheritance, the things that Gregor Mendel discovered. And certainly I was taught about that, and I taught that to my students in college. But what we now know is that epigenetic effects create non-Mendelian inheritance patterns. In other words, inheritance patterns that totally defy what we learned about Mendelian genetics. And these epigenetic changes underlie many normal developmental processes and actually lead to a lot of disease development. So the truth is, the bottom line is that many of the issues that we experience with our livestock today and with our crops are actually due to these negative compounding epigenetic effects. Now, what can cause negative epigenetic effects? Environmental exposure to toxicants, nutrients, infectious agents, all have significant effects on the exposed animals themselves or on their direct offspring. And then once these negative effects are encountered in those animals, then they can become, as I said before, transgenerational and be passed on to the next and the next generation. So exposure to these toxicants or all of these supplemental feedstuffs and everything else that we provide to our livestock can not only impact the epigenetics of the present livestock that are actually either exposed or fed a lot of these supplements, but it impacts their future generations. So Mendelian genetic theories have guided much of the biological research performed in recent history, and it's long been assumed that specific phenotypes arise only from DNA sequencing or Mendelian genetics, but we now know that is simply not the case. Now, this gets very technical, and I understand that, so I'm going to go through this just very quickly and then dive deeper into some things that you can much more clearly understand. So if you've had a lot of exposure to genetics courses, you may understand some of these things, but there are four main mechanisms by which epigenetics alter gene expression. And those four mechanisms include DNA methylation, histone modification, chromatin structure modification, and non-coding RNA. And these occur due to direct environmental insult during critical periods in the development of any organism, including humans. So all of these four things can happen in us. They can happen in our livestock. They can happen in our plants. For instance, research into epigenetics has shown that germline, in other words, early embryonic stages of an animal's life or a human's life, germline epigenetic transgenerational inheritance has been found to have occurred in plants, humans, livestock, insects, earthworms. In other words, again, anything that has DNA. And we know that epigenetic changes have been traced at least to the F3 generation. Pesticides have been shown to have dramatic transgenerational epigenetic effects on many animal models or systems, including the nervous system, the reproductive systems, the endocrine systems. and they even can cause cancer in our livestock. And we have certainly, over the last 2 decades, seen an ever increasing event of cancer in our livestock. This is something that, frankly, was quite rare in decades past, but now has become much more common. Likewise, on the flip side, hybrid vigor or heterosis has been shown to be critical in the breeding of domestic animals. And we now know that epigenetics plays a critical role in the creation of this hybrid vigor, or these heterotic effects in our livestock. So pesticides can create a negative compounding epigenetic effect, where hybrid vigor and heterosis, or even planned, thoughtful line breeding, both can create very positive epigenetic effects in our livestock. So let's quickly go through some epigenetic impacts in livestock species and talk about what some of these are. In cattle, we know that negative epigenetic effects impact lactation. For instance, one of the things that we have found is that when we have negative genetic impacts, we can see an abrupt shutdown of the alpha S1 casein synthesis during lactation. This is a critical protein that is necessary for lactation, and so we can actually have issues in lactation due to negative epigenetic effects. As I mentioned earlier, with the reproductive technologies such as cryopreservation of spermatozoa and embryo transfer technologies, we can have negative epigenetic effects that result in neonatal issues such as neonatal lethargy, large offspring syndrome, and a number of other negative factors. Epigenetic effects can depress immunity in our livestock, so we see a depressed immune response. And we can see impairment of nutrition in our livestock, such as through the impairment of absorption and metabolism of short-chain fatty acids in the digestive tract. Now think about this. We are reliant on fatty acids in our diet to be healthy, the omega-3s, the omega-7s, the omega-9s, the CLAs, all of those things that we all know about now that play a critical role in our health. And if we have negative epigenetic effects that are impairing this process in our livestock, then that ultimately is negatively affecting every human that is eating the protein produced from those animals. In pigs, some negative epigenetic effects include things such as skeletal muscle mass issues due to impairment of the myostatin gene. Here we go again, increased rates of cancer, cancerous tumors. Nutrition, once again, impairment of interactions between dietary folate, methionine, and choline, so essential amino acids. In sheep, we can have periconception epigenetic issues, and periconception is basically the period from conception to the early stages of pregnancy. And so these negative epigenetic effects include the impacting early programming that create obesity in sheep after they're born. And along with that, reduced stress tolerance. We can see epigenetic impacts on muscle fiber development, the effect of maternal undernutrition before muscle differentiation on the muscle fiber development in the newborn lamb, and in lamb carcass characteristics. So epigenetic effects can negatively impact the eating quality, the muscle fiber texture, and so forth of the meat produced from these lambs. And then in chickens, the truth is we're seeing quite a few negative epigenetic effects in the commercial chicken industry, particularly in broiler production. As a matter of fact, what we're seeing in a lot of commercial broiler production is a genome-wide DNA methylation issue. And this is particularly evident in the fast-growing broilers, those Cornish cross broilers that have been bred and are commonly used for commercial broiler production. It is very much evident in those Cornish cross broilers, and you see a distinct difference between the other breeds that are used for pastured broiler production that take longer to reach harvest weight maturity. Secondly, we are seeing, and this goes along with that genome-wide DNA methylation, we are seeing skeletal myogenesis issues. And this is causing the insulin-like growth factor 1 receptor regulation by microRNA to be basically thrown off kilter. And so we're seeing these, again, abnormal muscle growth in these broilers due to these negative epigenetic impacts. We're also seeing immunity issues and Marek's disease resistance and susceptibility is also evident. And again, all of this is epigenetic in nature. So make no mistake about it, epigenetics produce compounding, cascading effects. And just like in the rule of compounding that you've heard us talk about, compounding effects are never neutral. They're either positive or negative. Likewise with epigenetics, their effects are never neutral. They're either positive or negative. So obviously what we want to do is we want to be able to create positive epigenetic effects rather than negative. So here are some of the ways that, again, epigenetics affects livestock. It affects their health, their fertility, their milk component production, and calf weaning weight, and lifetime health. It impacts the longevity and soundness of our livestock. It impacts their ability to be able to be resistant to exposure to internal and external parasites. And it impacts proper endocrine system functioning. And oh, by the way, every one of these things I just listed, epigenetics impacts those exact same traits in us. Epigenetics also impacts the microbes in our soil. It impacts the microbes on and in our livestock, on and in us as humans. It impacts macroorganisms such as earthworms, insects, dung beetles. So therefore, because of this, it also impacts our soil health characteristics. Now, think about the ramifications of that. Most people never relate soil health to epigenetics. But make no mistake about it, epigenetic impacts soil health characteristics. It impacts our plants, our wildlife, birds, and again, ultimately us. So what are some of the things that cause negative epigenetic impacts in livestock? Exposure to chemicals of any kind. This can be synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. It impacts our microbial population. So all of these synthetics and chemicals that we're utilizing in agriculture today can have a very negative epigenetic impact on the microbes beneath the soil surface. For instance, we know that glyphosate significantly lower mycorrhizal fungi population, but they not only lower the mycorrhizal populations, but they also impact that epigenetic profile of the mycorrhizal fungi in our soil. And we know that this mycorrhizal fungi population imbalance is very important to proper functioning and mineral and water cycle functioning in our soils. Frankly, a lot of the things that we supplement our livestock with today also are creating negative epigenetic effects that are transgenerational in nature. In other words, the very offspring that we are dependent on for our profitability on a long-term basis can become more and more dependent on these supplements over time, and not just physiologically dependent, but epigenetically dependent. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, reproductive technologies can negatively affect epigenetics in livestock. So what are some of the ways that we can create positive epigenetic effects in our soil microbes, in our plants that we're growing for crops, to feed our livestock and to feed us, and ways to create positive epigenetics in our livestock and in us? Well, first of all, by creating and focusing on plant species diversity and complexity. This is one of the principles of soil health. It is one of the rules of adaptive stewardship. So here's the positive things that plant species diversity and complexity does to help improve epigenetic impacts. We produce a lot higher array of secondary and tertiary
Okay, evidently we're running into, Alan has some internet connection issues there. So I'm going to share my screen here and start in on my share of the presentation. Shane, are you able to see my first slide?
Not yet, Gabe. I think Alan's joining back here.
Oh.
Hold on for a second, please.
Okay, sorry, folks. I am back. I'll go to share screen again. The hotel internet kicked me off, so I apologize for that. Apparently, it made me renew right in the middle of our webinar. So again, I apologize for that. So we'll pick right back up where we left off. All right, so the way that we graze and manage our livestock plays a huge role in epigenetics and the expression of genes. And many of the issues that we're experiencing in our livestock are actually the fault of our own management. Better grazing practices result in better gene expression and therefore better performance in animal health. So the question then becomes, are we managing for diversity and complexity, or are we managing for monocultures? Now, let me give you an example in humans to help us relate this to what can happen in us. The Chamorro people of Guam are suffering ALS at a rate that is more than 100 times greater than anywhere else in the world. ALS is Lou Gehrig's syndrome. Now, we now know why. The Chamorro people of Guam consider flying foxes, which are actually giant fruit bats, a delicacy. And they love to catch and eat these giant fruit bats. And what we now know is these giant fruit bats eat a large quantity of cycad seeds. And these cycad seeds actually contain high concentrations of an amino acid known as BMAA. And these BMAAs are produced by cyanobacteria, blue-green algae in plant roots. And BMAA is a very potent neurotoxin. In massive amounts, it causes paralysis and even death. In smaller amounts, the effects are actually quite insidious and happen slowly. Cyanobacteria, this blue-green algae, produces these BMAAs in our bodies, in our brains. So how does it negatively impact us? And how does it negatively impact the Chamorro people? Well, BMAA causes a slow breakdown of proteins in the central nervous system, creating what we call tangled proteins in the brain. And it actually displaces the key amino acids in our nerve proteins called L-serine. Now, if we look at the opposite of what's happening with the Chamorro people in Guam and go to Okinawa, we find that Okinawans have the highest percentage of people that live to be 100 years old or older in the world. And one of the key reasons is because they eat diets that are high in L-serine in their diet. Additionally, studies in monkeys have shown that high amounts of this BMAA cause symptoms similar to Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and Lou Gehrig's disease. And again, they have found the tangled proteins in the beta amyloid plaques in the brains of these monkeys. So BMAA, in essence, turns a switch on that causes cascading disruptions in these nerve proteins, and whereas L-serine turns the switch off. So here's how it relates to us here in the US. Basically, we're the cause of our own demise. These cyanobacteria blooms are popping up in way too many places across the US. It's popping up in our lakes, in our bays, in the Gulf of Mexico, in many other places in the water. And the people, what we're now seeing is that populations in the US that live near these lakes and bays in the Gulf, where we have these annual blue-green algal blooms, are experiencing neurological diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Lou Gehrig's much higher than people that are not exposed to these blue-green algal blooms. We've seen this in states such as New Hampshire, Ohio, Minnesota, Iowa, Biscayne Bay, Texas, Louisiana, and so forth. And one large contributor to these blue-green algal blooms is, unfortunately, agriculture. So let's look up, to wrap up my portion, then we're going to transition to Gabe. Let's just look at a few examples in real life of epigenetics. So in this particular herd, this is a good friend of ours who shared these pictures with me. These cows are all managed exactly the same way. They're all moved to a fresh paddock every day under adaptive grazing. So they all have equal opportunity. But in these two individuals, you can see a clear, distinctive difference. The cow on the left is maintaining an excellent body condition. The cow on the right, she's, number one, larger frame. Number two, you can see that she's having a much harder time being able to maintain her body condition. The cow on the right has had negative epigenetic influences. And again, the same cows, the cow on the left, the cow on the right. You can see a distinct difference between the two. So the cow on the left, cow number 22, is going to pass to her offspring, starting at conception and in utero, positive epigenetic impacts The cow on the left, number 408, if given the opportunity. Now, actually, she's not going to be given the opportunity. She's going to be culled. But if given the opportunity to continue to reproduce, she would be passing down negative epigenetic effects to her offspring. Now, let's take a look at animals that have had more positive epigenetic effects and that better fit their environment and what that does to the economics of our production. This is real life data that I collected over more than 20 years from real farms and ranches in the southeastern US. And what we found on dozens of farms and ranches in this research is that the epigenetic impacts of the way these cattle were managed and raised and their eventual mature body weight has a very profound effect on their actual nutritional requirement on an annual basis. And the bottom line is this: the herds that had cows that were averaging a mature body weight of between 1,000 and 1,100 pounds in good body condition score were costing about $328 to $361 a year in total nutritional costs. That was in grazing and any supplemental hay or anything like that that was fed on an annual basis. Whereas those cows that were much larger, the cows that were 1,500 pounds in mature body weight in good body condition were costing quite a bit more. So if we compare the 1,500 pound cows to the 1,000 pound cows, the 1,500 pound cows were costing $165 more per head to support on an annual basis than the 1,000 pound cows. And this was just in feed cost alone. Now, if we look at their actual productivity, what we find is that the cows that were smaller in body size and good body condition and had more positive epigenetics not only performed better in terms of more calves weaned for the same number of acres required to support these cows, but at the end of the year, every year for 20 years, the difference in value between the calf crop on the same acreage, between the 1,000 to 1,100 pound cows and the 1,500 pound cows was quite significant, up to a $28,000 per year difference for the number of cows that I have listed here over in the left-hand column. This is an example of a very epigenetically sound cow. This is a Hereford cow that is the result of a closed herd line breeding system for several decades, starting in the 1930s. This cow was located at the Valle de Colombia Ranch in Mexico. And I can tell you that practically every cow there in this herd looks just like this cow. They're like peas in a pod. These cows over the last several decades have had no outside genetic influence, and they have had no supplementation. They are totally dependent on what they can graze and forage on a year-round basis in their high mountain desert environment. And this is the result. Gabe's going to show you an even more extreme environment and the epigenetic impacts on another set of Hereford cattle in a moment. But these are the type of cattle that are high performing, low cost, having excellent longevity, fertility, productivity. These are the type of cattle that make you money year in and year out. And they pass very positive epigenetic impacts on to their offspring. An example again of two different cows. The cow on the left, epigenetically sound, fits her environment, adapted to her environment in the desert. The cow on the right, totally wrong for her environment, epigenetically unsound. Let's look again at some examples of epigenetically sound individuals. A really nice formed Hereford bull here that has very positive epigenetics. A very nice Angus bull located in the desert. Again, positive epigenetics. These cows shown eating cactus in the desert. You know, they are highly epigenetically adapted and will pass very positive epigenetic traits down to their offspring. In dairy, we see this quite often. The two cows that you see pictured here, same farm, born the same month, in the same year. They have the same daily opportunities. This particular dairy is located in Cold Springs, Minnesota. These cows go out every day to graze between the morning milking and the evening milkings, and are then also fed a supplemental ration in the parlor at both the morning and evening milkings. The Jersey cross cow on the left, although significantly smaller, is producing 5 to 10 pounds more fluid milk daily, plus significantly higher milk components, milk fat, milk protein. The Holstein cow on the right requires 30% more feed daily to support herself. And even at that 30% more feed, you can see she's not supporting herself very well. The farmer estimates that the Jersey cow will last 8+ lactations in his herd. The Holstein cow will not last 3 lactations. He's already got her earmarked for culling. And this is that same dairy farm. This is the farmer moving his cattle, and he does this on a daily basis. I want you to pay particular attention to this herd, because what you're seeing here is evidence that what this farmer is doing is producing profoundly positive epigenetic effects that are going to have a very positive transgenerational impact on his herd and positively impact the productivity of his farm and the net profitability of his farm for many decades to come. So what you saw here, number one, was these cows are allowed to actively go out and graze every day and feed themselves. Number two, the plant species in these pastures is highly diverse. So these cows have the opportunity every day to be able to go out and to graze high diversity diet. They're able to have an incredible array of phytonutrients in their diet that are both medicinal and antiparasitic in nature. And then finally, you see that they are actually raising their replacement heifers with the cows. Very few dairies are doing this, but you saw the calves with the cows. What we have found is that when these dairy heifers are raised with their dams, the positive epigenetic effects are quite profound. And these calves perform far better lifetime in a multiplicity of ways and cost the farmer far less lifetime for a higher level of performance and productivity. And oh, by the way, he is also very positively impacting the epigenetics of the microbes beneath the soil. This is another example of positive epigenetic impact. It impacts our wildlife as well. This is what we have seen on our own farm. We have seen very strong evidence that as we improve the microbial population in the soil, the plant species diversity that is growing in the soil, then our wildlife improves significantly. The same deer genetics have shifted dramatically on our farm. Years ago, before we were able to have a positive impact on the microbial population in the soil. And before we were able to significantly alter our plant species diversity, a good deer was a 120 class deer. And for any of you that understand that, that's a decent deer, but not a huge deer. Now we are routinely harvesting deer that are 150, 170, even 200 class. The deer that you see pictured in the middle was a 185 class deer. These are the exact same deer genetics. No additional genetics were introduced. They are the same genetics from the wild that have existed here for decades. But the deer are much, much larger, much healthier now due to the very positive epigenetics. I'm going to also show you here what has happened over a period of time at the Las Damas Ranch in Chihuahua, Mexico. And I'm going to relate that back to the positive epigenetic factors that are also occurring at the Las Damas. If we look at this time sequence, pay attention to the red arrow. You can see the mesquite tree there in the background, so that you see that the pictures were taken from the same vantage point. This is the Las Damas in 2015, in 2018, and in 2021. Profoundly different in the epigenetics and the microbes, in the plants growing there, and ultimately the livestock being produced on the Las Damas. And we see that in the plants here. This is tabasa grass that exists on many ranches in the Chihuahuan Desert. The picture on the right is tabasa grass at the Las Damas Ranch. The picture on the left is tabasa grass taken the same day, same amount of precipitation on the neighboring ranch. Distinct difference in the morphology and physiology of this exact same plant species. On the left, you see a plant that is healthy, that is thriving. The width of the blade is much wider. The total biomass that exists there is far greater. The nutritive value is far greater. And even the texture of the plant, the leaf is far more velvety in texture. On the right, the blades are very narrow, almost needle-like. This grass is actually starting to oxidize. And remember, these pictures were taken on the same day with the same amount of precipitation. Much lower in nutrient density and far more coarse to the touch. So a distinct morphological and physiological difference. And as we look at the two up close together, side by side, again, you see a very distinct epigenetic difference. And once again, this is transgenerational in nature. As each of these goes to seed and produces their offspring, the tabasa grass on the regenerative ranch is going to continue to produce an ever more productive and healthier plant than the tabasa grass produced from the seed on the ranch that is much more conventionally managed. I love this quote by Masanobu Fukuoka, the author of One Straw Revolution, where he says, "It was in an American desert that I suddenly realized that rain does not fall from the heavens, it comes from the ground. Desert formation is not due to the absence of rain, but the rain ceases to fall because the vegetation has disappeared." Another example of positive epigenetics. This is one of our clients. They have a pecan orchard in Oklahoma. And this is a report that we received back from this pecan grower this year, where he said, "Our trees are much healthier than they have ever been." And they were very conventional producers. They were following to the T all of the conventional wisdom in science and consulting that they were being given by the land-grant universities and others. And they were steadily seeing their soils decline. They were seeing an ever-increasing reliance on inputs such as synthetic fertilizers, multiple fungicide applications per year, insecticide applications per year, and so forth. So what we did was we introduced them to regenerative principles and encouraged them to go in and plant complex cover crops in between the rows of trees in their orchard, and then to graze these cover crops. And as a result of the implementation of these regenerative principles and practices, here's what we found. This year, they found that from their leaf tissue analysis, that their nitrogen and zinc were far better than they have ever been. They're going to have an outstanding crop. And as a matter of fact, they did. They had an outstanding crop this year. And they have plenty of armor on their soil. In the past, they were being taught to use a lot of herbicides to keep any armor from being on the soil, to keep living plants from growing in the soil other than their trees, because they were taught that any other plant is competition for nutrients and water for their trees. But as you can see from the pictures that they supplied, their trees are exceedingly healthy today. And even the nutrient analysis of the pecans has shown that their pecans are far more nutrient dense now than they were in years past. And this is why I want to create positive epigenetic effects, because we are building for future generations of our soil microbes, future generations of our crops, our pasture crops, of our livestock, and of us. These two pictures are my youngest son and my three grandsons. The biggest there, I took these pictures in, I believe, 2007 on the farm. The biggest there is my youngest son. The other three are his nephews, my grandsons. And I do what I do because I want them to have better opportunities than I had. I want them to be healthier than I am. I want them, as they grow up and get married and have children, to pass along very positive epigenetic effects to their kids. So they are why I do what I do and why we do what we do within Understanding Ag. So, Gabe, I'm going to send it over to you.
Okay, Ellen, will you stop share? Did you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen here. Nope. Let's see.
Gotcha.
There we go. See that okay, Alan? You got the first slide? Okay. Okay, thank you for that, Alan. It's great to be with everyone today. I'm going to start by giving some examples of what Alan talked about. What you see here is the Aleutian Islands off the state of Alaska. Talk a little bit about Chirikoff Island. It is obviously in the Bering Sea. It's extremely windblown, grows a tremendous amount of forage, but only for a very short time of the year. Now, initially, cattle were introduced onto this island from Russia in the 1790s. They had management initially, but they were brought over obviously because of the tremendous amount of forage that was on that island. However, what happened was that those animals then were left unmanaged for over 100 years. Here's what has come from that. Take a look at the animals that you're seeing on this screen. Look at the depth of body, look at the width, look at how easy fleshing they are, even in that environment. The result, like I said, a highly fertile herd, very short calving season. They tended to group up and calve in sync with nature. You know, people often think that, well, if we do not pull the bulls, so to speak, we're going to have a calves year round. Well, if we leave it up to nature, over time, only those animals that calve when it's ideal will survive. And I'll use for an example, take a look at our wild populations, bison, elk, deer, pronghorn, etc. Are they dropping their calves and fawns year round? No, they calve and fawn in synchrony with nature. This herd is also free from disease. And they are very, very structurally correct. This is a picture I took from a newspaper that I purchased. That newspaper was printed, as it says in the lower left, in 1888. Look at the bull that's depicted there. Look at the amount of volume and the fleshing ability on that animal. Here is a copy of the Breeder's Gazette that I have from 1882. And no, David Kleinschmidt, I did not purchase that new. Take a look at that cow in this picture, though. I don't think you can get any more spring or rib and volume in an animal than she has. Let's take a look at animals today. What happened? Take a look and just think about the beef animals that we see as we travel around. Compare this to those animals I showed you on the Aleutian Islands. Definitely not the depth of body, definitely not spring or rib, not the fleshing ability. These are much taller animals, longer, leaner. Same with the cow herd. Where's the beef? What happened? Where did we go wrong? Now think of what Alan talked about with the epigenetics and the negative epigenetics effects that are seen from many of these practices we're using in beef production today. It's making sense, isn't it? Talk a little bit about a case study, and I'm going to use my own ranch as this case study and talk to you about the journey that we've been on since we've really began to understand the power of epigenetics and how they can play a part. This is a picture of the cow herd out on summer pasture on our ranch. For 25 plus years, I was in the conventional type model. I raised registered cattle, had a bull sale. These cattle were very high performance cattle that were bred for what the feedlots wanted. We're always told that, well, they're buying our cattle, we have to supply them with what they want. If you really look at what feedlots want, they want a large framed animal that can consume massive quantities of feed, because inevitably they're in the business of selling feed. And so they need that high performance type of cattle. I AI'd extensively, used embryo transplant. I used EPDs, studied EPDs, and bred according to EPDs. We fed a lot of grain to our beef cattle, the calves and the bulls, not so much to the cow herd, but the cow herd was fed a quote unquote balanced ration for much of the winter. We used vaccines, we used wormers, salt, mineral, many other forms of supplementation. Here's what I ended up with. I thought I was doing a good job breeding cattle for my environment. But what we ended up with was large framed, high performance type of cattle that really express the negative epigenetic effects that Alan talked about. Yes, we could get a high percentage of them bred in a very short breeding season, but we were having to supplement these cattle in order to get that performance. Look at, a lot of people would think that, oh, that's a good looking cow there. Today, what I see when I look at this picture is a cow that requires a lot of inputs, very high input costs. I really learned that I needed to change the way I saw things. What makes a rancher money is having animals that fit his or her environment. Form follows function. We need to have the type of animals that fit our environment. We also need to quit propping up that bottom end. So often we supplement our livestock according to what that bottom end needs. Let's do away with that bottom end, then we don't have to supplement them. I also really believe we need to allow the animals to cull themselves. What I mean by that is no excuses, no second chances. If they do not produce, rebreed, raise a calf, and do it in a profitable manner, they need to be culled. We also need to calve in sync with nature. For years, I calved in February and early March in North Dakota. Talk about out of context, talking about out of sync with nature. Back in 2009, we went from calving in February and March to calving from May 15th through the end of June. I will never forget that first year I made that switch. I told my wife I should have to pay somebody to allow me to enjoy calving this much. It's absolutely a game changer. And the next thing we did is we pulled all the crutches. We pulled the vaccines, the wormers, and over time, we pulled mineral and salt. Now, I am in no way here today telling you you should do that. That's a decision you have to make. And I'm going to talk more about this at the end of the presentation. My context, as many of you are aware, I live in North Dakota, God's country. We're in an obvious northern environment. It's predominantly cool season. 75+% of the species are cool season species because on a quote unquote average year, we have approximately 110 frost-free days. So we need to allow that environment to express itself. And then the animals we have to be able to perform in that context, the context of my environment. I'm not going to pay attention to what the feedlots want. I'm going to pay attention to what works best in my environment. This is a picture, not from 2021, but of a perennial pasture on our ranch. You see, we grow the majority of the forage we have for the year is grown in a 60-day period between mid-May to mid-July. That's pretty much where we're going to grow the bulk of our forage. And then we need to have animals that can survive then on that forage once it's mature and highly lignified. Animals in our environment need to thrive on that mature forage. we have such a short window, you're not going to be able to graze all your pastures in that very short window. You need to allow that forage to grow. And then what is a cow good at? A cow has that wonderful 4-chambered stomach that's able to take that highly lignified forage and turn it into protein. Why not take advantage of the epigenetics and breed cattle that fit that environment? This is simply a picture showing you, this photo was taken in August. You can see how dry that plant material is, but I would contend that it's highly nutritious, full of phytonutrients. And look at the diversity you see in just in that small area of the picture there. It's going to provide the necessary nutrients for that cow or whichever species of livestock to thrive. Now, that is, if we've done a good job of allowing the epigenetics to come through all the way from the animal down through the soil. We run a 30-day breeding season on our heifers. We expose every heifer to bulls for 30 days. Now, one might ask, why such a short breeding season? And I'm going to say something here that's a bit controversial, but listen to my thought process on that. I believe if we're getting over 50% of our heifers bred in a 30-day season, we're feeding them way too well. We need to make sure that we are not overfeeding those heifers during their life cycle, because that would cost me money. Okay. I really think that over time, the cattle, by being pushed like we are, will develop the epigenetics to be able to breed in a very short season on very low quality forage, because that's going to put more dollars in my pocket. Now, full disclosure, we are running any opens and grass finishing them. So that is a lucrative market for us. We can actually make more money selling a heifer by the cut as grass finished beef as compared to selling her as a bred heifer. Okay, so that's part of the reason for our decisions to do this. The cow herd has a 45-day breeding season. And by cow herd, I mean everything is running in one group. Our wet twos on up to, we PG'd cattle yesterday, and we have several cows in the herd that are 19 years old and still going strong. We also now raise our own bulls, and we've been doing since 2009. There's been very little outside genetics brought into our herd. So what my son Paul simply does is he's out with that cow herd, moving them on a daily basis while they're calving. And if it's an old cow, she's structurally sound, good feet and legs, good udder, he just leaves it intact as a bull. If it's a young cow, or he just does not like the way she looks, then he will ban that calf at birth. And that's done simply for ease, because that's the only time those animals will be handled then until they're weaned at 10 months of age. So we will leave a large number of bull calves intact, and then they will be turned out as yearlings with the cows. And then we will let them select which are the most aggressive, which are going to be dominant, and breed. This is the type of epigenetics that's coming through in the calves. If you look at that calf, I mean, it's obviously she is moderate in size, easy fleshing. You can see the muscling on her. And this calf here, this photo was taken in August, and that's a late May born calf. So only about 90 days of age, but you can already see the expressions in here. You know, when I was in the bull business selling bulls, I thought I knew best. I thought that by using EPDs, AI, I could select the animals that would perform the best. There's nothing that can properly select animals for your environment like nature can. Let nature do the selecting for you. Just some of the calves, I show this because I want you to notice how highly lignified that forage is, how mature it is. This is my context. You have to allow the epigenetics in your livestock species to come through for your own operation, okay? Whatever that environment may be. This is the type of cows we're raising, and that cow does have a calf on her. Look at the body condition that cow is in. And then this photo was taken this year. We literally did not green up until we got a little rain here in October. But this photo was taken in August. Look how dry that forage is there. Yet look at the condition that animal is in. I tell people I want a cow herd that looks like Gabe Brown, short, thick, easy keeping. That they have to be that way in order to perform in our environment in any condition. Our cow herd grazes throughout the majority of winter with calves still on them. As I said, we calve in late May and June, leave the calves on the cows usually till the first week in April, and they graze through snow most of the winter. Last year, we fed the cow herd, we allowed them to bale graze, which is setting bales out on perennial pasture for a total of 18 days. Okay, we're in a northern environment. Now, most years it's about 40 to up to 60 days, but our goal is to get them to survive grazing through that snow the majority of winter. And during the winter, our cows predominantly water on snow. It allows us to graze areas of the ranch that we do not have water on. You can take a look at this is a bred heifer, keeping her condition out grazing through snow, very dry, lignified material. We also incorporate some cover crops and run the cow-calf pairs out on those cover crops during winter. It allows us to get livestock onto the cropland, integrated onto the cropland, thus helping the epigenetics, the microbiome of the biology in that cropland. Now you might say, well, it's the middle of winter, but we have to realize that biology sporulates and can survive in the manure pat until conditions are more ideal. One of the real reasons I like to leave the calves on the cows all winter is because those cows are teaching those calves how to survive in our environment. If a storm's coming, they're going to seek protection. That calf will learn that. That cow is also teaching that calf which species of plants to eat to survive in our context, thus adding to that epigenetics, providing that epigenetic effect. I took these photos a year ago. We turned these grass finishers into a new paddock, and they went right to this Russian olive tree and started consuming it. Here you see they're just stripping the leaves off of this Russian olive. What they're really doing is selecting for certain phytonutrients. The work that Understanding Ag is doing with Dr. Stefan Van Vliet is showing that animals have that ability. And Dr. Fred Provenza wrote about this in his book, Nourishment. Animals have the ability to balance their own diet. Evidently, there was something in this Russian olive that their body desired and they wanted. Now, they will have, they have the epigenetics to determine that and to balance their own diet. Take a look at the manure pat. Animals can and will balance their own diet if we allow them to. But in order for that to happen, you have to have that species diversity in the plant community, and then you have to have the healthy soil microbiome in order to allow that plant to have the phytonutrients. Then the livestock can graze that and balance their own diet. So on our ranch, we've been down this path about 12 years now. We went from cows that were routinely weighing from 1,350 to 1,450 pounds down to now, if that cow is in good flesh, she may weigh 1,100 pounds. And she'll have a calf on her for about 10 months, breed back within that 45-day breeding season on forage alone with no supplementation. That has allowed us then, the epigenetics has allowed us to be able to grass finish beef in our environment, in our context. Now, I want to be very clear. We're not grass finishing, obviously, year round. We have to harvest the majority of our animals in late September and October to capture those phytonutrients and be able to provide the highest quality beef that we can. These are some ribeye steaks from the animal that I just showed you. Who says we can't have well-marbled, grass-finished beef? These principles, as Alan stated, can be used for any species. We need to make sure that all of our species of livestock are able to have the epigenetics to thrive in our context. We run sows, farrow sows, and then raise those pastured hogs. We market about 400 head of pastured hogs per year. And what we found, it took a while for those genetics to come through. I often tell people it probably would have been faster for me to go down south and capture some wild hogs and bring them up, but they would be out of context in my environment. Our hogs winter outside. They're not inside at all. We just provide them with some bedding, and they do just fine, even in our extreme cold temperatures. We also have a flock of ewes, and we lamb them same time as we're calving cows, late May and June, and raise grass-finished lamb. The same principles apply. We have never wormed our sheep. We've never given them a vaccination, and we just don't have those issues. Now, part of it obviously is because of the amp grazing that we practice. We're moving our sheep on a regular basis, allowing them a very diverse diet, and then not having them graze those forages too low. So we just don't run into the issues with worms that many see. Even microbiology, as Alan said, epigenetics affects microbiology also. That's a water bear swimming on a film of water between soil aggregates. That's what, these are in our soil, yet do we think of what our management is doing for them? We need to start realizing that everything, as Ellen said, is intertwined, and everything has either positive or negative compounding, cascading effects. It takes time, though. I just want to say I would not recommend going cold turkey if you cannot afford it. Back in 2009, when we did this, we went cold turkey. We had a large fallout. We literally sold almost half the cow herd within the first 2 or 3 years. Financially, I could afford it. It's up to you to do it at a pace that fits your context. The thing I will say, though, is you, as Shane New always says, you need to be intentional. You need to stick to it. You can't say, well, I'm going to let that cow slide, even though she's open. She's one of my favorites. No excuses. You got to be intentional, and you have to stick to it. With that, I'm going to bring Alan back in and ask him to start going through the questions. I'm going to put up this slide, though, just to remind you of upcoming webinars. Alan?
Thank you, Gabe. Really appreciate that. And that drove home some real life examples to the impact of epigenetic selection. So we'll dive into the questions that we have presented already, and then we'll open it up for additional ones as well. So the first question is from Willie. And Willie asked, would cattle that are positively epigenetically adapted to a Wisconsin farm be equally well adapted in Mexico? If not, why? So I'm going to start and then ask Gabe to chime in here, but I'm going to answer this in 2 parts. So Willie, first of all, one of the things that we have found is that animals that epigenetically fit their environment are better able to transition to others, but you're taking them out of context, okay? And it's far, far better to develop your epigenetics within your context. If you want animals that are going to perform highly profitably and have tremendous longevity and fertility and soundness and be low-cost producers, they need to be within their environment. The same thing with our plants. This is why we have also found, and Shane, can chime in here as well, but in plants, what we have found is that, most of us, as we're planting cover crops or planting cash crops, we're taking seed that is provided from another area under an entirely different type of production parameters, and then planting it in our soils and expecting it to be epigenetically adapted. Well, it's not. So what we're finding is that if we can start saving our own seed again, like farmers used to do, like my grandfather and my father did, we actually are able to produce in our plants genetics that are far more epigenetically adapted. Gabe, Shane?
I would just say, Alan, a case in point, I agree with what you said. Yes, they would be better suited to survive than most other cattle if you moved environments, but use this as an example. You showed the picture of Alejandro's cattle eating that prickly pear cactus. I would hate to take a group of Wisconsin adapted cattle down there. They would have no idea what to do with those cactus. So you're absolutely right. And the same goes with plants, especially what we've learned with Dr. James White and rhizophagy and the ability of seed to transfer that microbiology. Extremely important to use seed also that's adapted to your environment.
Exactly. Shane, do you have any further comments on that?
No, you've done a great job explaining that. I mean, and like you've discussed, and what we're starting to see is seed is not seed is not seed. I mean, some of the best seed you're going to produce is seed coming off your own operations, especially in some of these perennial grass systems on your own farms and ranches.
Thank you. Second question, again from Willie. He says, Alan, would you kindly explain the epigenetic effect on human health and this influence on the limited gene complement that human beings are blessed with? So, Willie, what we now know is that, we have many, many diseases that are now much more prevalent in our population, particularly here in the US and all of North America, quite frankly, that even just a few decades ago were far, far less prevalent. And if you track the use of synthetics, of chemicals, and other things, and you track the decline in the epigenetic health of the microorganisms in our soil, and our plants, and our crops, and our livestock, therefore the animal proteins that we consume and the plants that we consume over these last several decades, you will find that that tracks pretty darn spectacularly well with this rise in human health anomalies. And so we know that what is happening in our environment and the foods that we're now consuming that are much more highly processed and far less nutrient dense are absolutely limiting the positive epigenetic effects that impact our health and are actually creating very negative epigenetic effects in our bodies. And unfortunately, this is going to be visited on our children and our grandchildren because of the transgenerational nature of these epigenetic effects. So we really, as a population, need to start thinking about this and how we are not just negatively impacting ourselves, but again, we're negatively impacting those future generations. So any of our other panelists have any other comments on that? Okay, the next question from Eric. He says, is harvesting a high quality, diverse cover crop in the form of silage feasible to extend the time frame for grass finishing? Gabe, I'm going to ask you to initially address that.
Yes, Eric, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, but I would contend at what cost? And realize that on my own operation, we used to put up haylages, green chop, and then feed that. I know that would extend grass finishing, but look at the cost that's involved. And if I may, Ellen, I'll just tie this into the next question from Lynn. Lynn asks me, does the profitability of your cattle operation depend on your direct marketing abilities? Would your operation be profitable utilizing normal/conventional selling practices? And I would say this, the direct marketing obviously adds another layer of profitability. However, through the use of epigenetics and breeding all of our livestock to fit our context, we would be able to make more money than the conventional producer because we've truly become a least cost producer. So, and then you might say, well, those livestock though wouldn't fit what a feedlot might want. Well, what I say to that is just go to the sale barn and look at the highest selling group of a certain weight class of cattle. And then what does a so-called lower quality of the same weight class bring? Chances are it's at max $5 difference, probably even less, maybe $3 a hundredweight difference. So somebody will always buy the livestock. That I'm not worried about at all. So to answer both Eric's question, yes, you can extend it, but you're also going to then add significant cost to it. And it's up to each individual to determine if that cost is worth the premium that they're getting. And then Lynn, when what we're finding, it doesn't matter whether we're talking livestock, whether we're talking grain production, as you move down the regenerative path, you are able to produce grain, beef, chickens, whatever the case may be, at a much lower price point as compared to when we farmed and ranched conventionally. Anyone else want to chime in on those?
Gabe, I'll, for Eric's question, I would just say, and I'm going to use a dairy example here. We're working with quite a few dairy producers, and what we are finding, and obviously they've got to feed those cows year round. So they are harvesting silage to feed. And what we are finding is that when they are planting a much more diverse crop to harvest as a silage versus straight corn silage, that or wheatlage or oatlage, that we are seeing profoundly positive benefits, health, production, milk components, everything in those dairy cattle that are being fed this much more diverse silage crop. So yes, it does help. And then Lynn, for yours, I'll just relate one thing. We direct market just like Gabe does, but what I can definitively say that if we had to sell our calves into the commodity market, yes, we would make a profit. We would not be losing money. So the next question is from Richard, and Richard is asking, in Southeast Oklahoma, what cover crops do you suggest? I'm going to start this, and I'm going to ask David Kleinsmith to chime in here. So Richard, first, we need to know your context before we can adequately answer that question. David, would you like to chime in here, sir?
Yeah, I'd agree. We need to know, what your context is, what kind of class of livestock you're wanting to graze, when you're wanting to graze it. In Southeast Oklahoma, I tell you, you've got basically everything's wide open to you, depending on your planting dates and everything. So you've got so many options there. Just like Alan said earlier, it all goes back to your context.
Thank you, David. Okay, the next question is from Josh Ballard. And before I go to Josh, Richard, please feel free to email us, and we will be happy to address your question in detail, but we are going to have to have a conversation with you to gather a lot more about your context before we can properly answer that. The question from Josh is, what would you consider the minimal herd size to have enough genetic diversity to raise your own bulls for in-herd use? As a geneticist, I will start this, and since Gabe has been actively doing this, I'm going to ask him to chime in afterwards. So first of all, Josh, when you consider raising your own bulls from within your own herd, you are going to be line breeding. Okay, which is a form of inbreeding. So you have to immediately recognize that. And line breeding works best if you have truly genetically superior individuals. So before you start considering this, you've got to take a long, hard look at the current genetic quality of the individuals within your herd and the epigenetic quality of those individuals. Are they producing within your environment with very minimal input to a high degree of performance? If they're not, at this point, do not consider saving your own replacements because they're not genetically or epigenetically ready yet. But if you are producing superior individuals and it's clear and they are surviving and thriving on low input, then is the time to start considering that. Now, from a genetic diversity standpoint and for genetic selection purposes, I typically like to recommend that people have at least 100 cows or more. So that's going to be my recommendation. Gabe.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything you said there, Alan. Make sure that to the best of your knowledge, you're picking from animals that are at the very top of your herd in terms of flesh and ability. One of the things we do is select from only older cows that have proven their fertility over a long period of time. I'm going to ask Doug to weigh in on this too, because Doug's doing quite a bit of this also. Doug? Oh, maybe Doug isn't with us anymore.
No, I'm here.
There he is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you bet, Gabe. I would agree with all that as well. You know, we've been here in Missouri in heavy fescue country. We, felt that we really needed to try to, select our own bulls for adaptability. And I started early on. When I started doing that, I didn't necessarily keep a whole bunch of bulls to use right off the bat. I kept 3 or 4 or 5 just to evaluate where I was at in my operation, to start comparing those bulls that I could raise with what I could purchase. And so that was how I started doing it. Was just slowly started keeping a few, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 a year. And that was my evaluation to see what kind of progress I was making. And then at one point we had a field day with a bunch of people there to evaluate bulls. And when they all agreed that the best bulls were out of my commercial home raised cows, better than the bulls that I had purchased and better than the bulls that I had AI sired, I realized at that point that, okay, maybe I was there. So.
Mm-hmm. Say, Alan, there's some questions you may not be able to see since you had to jump back on. So I'm going to go back and ask those questions first. And the first one, Alan, I'll throw to you. Ruth asked, does this mean that naturally sired animals, in other words, natural conception, is superior to AI?
So Ruth, and I'm a geneticist, reproductive physiologist. I, at one point in my life, owned a reproductive clinic, and I have AI'd literally hundreds of thousands of cattle and done embryo transfer in many thousands of cattle. And from that experience, I can absolutely tell you that, yes, naturally sired individuals are epigenetically superior to both artificially inseminated produced individuals and embryo transfer produced individuals.
I certainly agree with that, Alan. Ruth has another question here. You can elaborate on, please. How stable or predictive is the expression of epigenetics?
All right, you cannot escape epigenetics and the expression of epigenetics. And it's actually quite stable, either positive or negative. So, once you influence negative epigenetics, you're going to have to cull that out of the population. Once you influence positive epigenetics, again, that's going to be passed on to the next generation and the next, as long as you are continuing those management practices that are favorable to the production of positive epigenetics. So they're stable, and that means that they're going to be there for quite a while once you influence them, either positive or negative.
Thank you, Alan. Karen has a question. Discuss the increase of twins and what that is a result of when using natural service, not AI. I'm assuming they're seeing more twins when they're using natural service.
All right, if you're seeing more twins with a natural service, there is definitely a genetic tendency towards that. So you may have in your herd individuals that have a genetic tendency to have a higher twinning rate. And that's going to continue as long as you are continuing to propagate those same genetics in your herd. If they're doing that naturally and you're not having a problem with those individuals accepting, the twins and being able to support those twins, you really don't have much of a problem, to be quite frank with you. But if your cattle are not able to support those twins, then you need to start culling out those individuals that are twinning and not allowing them to propagate further in your herd.
Thank you, Alan. Anyone else have any comments on that? If not, here, Emily has a question. Does supplemental L-serine overcome or cancel out the effects of BMAA? For example, in populations that live near bloom-prone areas.
So Emily, in response to that question, yes, it does. The source of L-serine is really important here. And what we have found is that it's actually better if you can consume this in a natural, complete diet rather than an isolated L-serine supplement. So you'll get better results in canceling out the effects of the BMAA and the tangled proteins in the brain if you do this through your diet rather than just that L-serine supplement. However, definitely if you live in one of these areas, you absolutely, one way or the other, you need to increase the L-serine in your diet.
Thank you, Alan. Shane, I'm going to come to you on this one. Lynn asks, what grazing practices are required to enhance plant diversity on an existing native pasture? And then also, how about on a near monoculture tame grass pasture?
Well, one thing, technique that we like to use is rest. We know you're not going to be able to maybe rest an entire pasture, but especially through the growing season, maybe take just a few acres and paddock off and allow it a very long rest period and see what kind of diversity is expressed there. Then come back in once that seed is produced, then look at grazing it, then allowing the animals to dispense that seed back further out into the landscapes. We can look at different stock densities to help with plant diversity. I know that sometimes a major disruption, like a large stock density in a small area for a very short time, can help stimulate a lot of that latent seed bank to allow diversity to express itself. Even like on these monoculture tame introduced species of pastures, that's a good practice to maybe utilize different stock densities at different times of the year, and then give extended rest periods, see what diversity appears after those disruptions.
Thank you, Shane. I'm going to ask Doug to chime in there too, because Doug has extensive experience with fescue and getting some diversity into those fescue pastures. Doug?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the techniques that we would use would be the same as what Shane mentioned. The very number one is going to be rest. Way too many pastures are not rested long enough, particularly if you're going to try to get natives to come back in. The native warm season grasses, as well as the native cool season grasses, tend to be a lot more upright growing than our introduced cool season grasses like fescue and brome and orchard grass, and they require really a much longer rest period, recovery period. But in many cases, it'll take some trampling and some stimulation to open that canopy up, and then a long rest period to allow those warm seasons to come in.
Thank you, Doug. Alan, I'm going to ask you to talk just a little bit about rest periods and how to determine what's the best rest period for your own environment.
Absolutely, Gabe. So, first of all, most people absolutely need to rest their pastures longer. The vast majority of people are coming back way too soon. And when we look at adequate rest period, you really need to be letting those your plant species, particularly your grasses, get a lot more mature. You need to have a lot more, frankly, seed production in there. And this is the antithesis to what most people believe in terms of how they should be grazing. Remember what Gabe showed earlier about, he's got a very short growing season. And if Gabe does not graze mature forages, he has nothing to graze for 8 months out of the year, folks. So how in the world would he survive with that? And how, and that's also what the wild ruminants experienced. So how in the heck did they survive? Now that's important for a number of reasons. So more rest, allowing your plants to recover to at least mid-stage maturity, no matter where you're located. And so that's really the key factor. In the more arid environments, that can mean a year, 18 months, or even 2 years of rest before you come back to any particular area. In the more temperate environments, we have typically found you need a rest period, frankly, of at least 80 days. And we actually prefer longer. And again, that's antithetical to what most of us have been taught and what you believe. But not only is it important because of the ability to be able to adequately feed your livestock through the year and for your pastures to properly recover, but that recovery is critical for positive epigenetic impacts to occur in the soil microbes and in the plants themselves, and thus your livestock. If you want to build soil organic matter, if you want to build carbon, if you want to build nutrient cycling and water cycling ability, rest is critical in achieving all of that. And if you do not do that, I can guarantee you're not going to build those other things.
Thank you, Alan. Josiah asks, would you all suggest starting a herd with animals from the area under similar management and then further refining them? What would you consider to be an appropriate definition of area? Alan?
Okay, be glad to start with that. So Josiah, first of all, never buy your seed stock out of sales, out of a, from a catalog, anything like that. When you buy seed stock, go look at the herds that are producing them. Go see what they are doing. Are they managing similar to you? Are they producing the phenotype that you desire in your cattle? Are they high input or low input? Because that already has set the epigenetics for the very cattle that you're selecting and that you want to thrive in your area. And are their cattle or other livestock being raised on similar forages as what you have on your farm, your ranch? So that's what I define as the area. That's how I would define area. It's not going to be a specific geographical boundary. It's going to be all of those other factors that are going to be critical here. So in the only way, Josiah, that you can do that is take the time to go visit those herds that you're going to, or flocks that you're going to be selecting seed stock from, and make sure that they are doing what is going to influence positive epigenetics that will then produce positive epigenetics for you.
Certainly. Thank you, Alan. Adam and Betty ask, what effect does fermented feed have on the epigenetics of a herd, specifically dairy cows? Alan?
Kent Solberg, are you on?
I didn't see him.
Okay, Kent may not be on this evening. Boy, this is a great question for Kent, but I can address this as well. Kent and I are doing a lot of work with dairy producers. So number one, it's not just fermented feed. It is fermented feedstuffs from diverse plant populations in highly microbially active soil. Now, if we have fermented feedstuffs from those parameters, then it is an outstanding feed for positively influencing the epigenetics of your dairy herd. And it's even more critical that you start your heifers this way. And that firmly establishes their epigenetics from that point forward, and then the epigenetics of their offspring. You know, fermented feedstuffs, just like us eating fermented foods or drinking fermented drinks, is very beneficial for our gut microbial population. So is it with our livestock as well.
Thank you, Alan. Doug, I'm going to come to you with this question from Philip. When you are first starting a herd, how do you determine which animals should be best for a foundation herd for your future cattle operation in your environment?
Well, when I started, I started managing them like I thought the grass needed to be managed. And then if they got bred and had a calf and got bred back, then they stayed at that point, as I was building the herd. And you had mentioned it earlier, anything that didn't meet that criteria, they got culled. We also looked at things like, attitude. We didn't want any crazy ones. I had young kids. And so we culled a lot of those things like that out. But for the most part, it was, if I managed my herd like I wanted them to be managed, my grass like I needed it to be managed, and that cow could fit the bill. She could have a calf, she could get bred back. It didn't matter if she was black or red or big or short, early on, that was the only criteria. Had a calf and get bred back, and she stayed.
Well, Shane, any comments on that?
No, Doug did a good job addressing that.
Okay, Alan, this one for you. Rick asks, in regards to the epigenetic effect using embryo transfers that Alan listed, should I stay away from breeders that also use AI until we have enough cattle to select our own bulls in context with our environment?
So Rick, quite frankly, I would definitely try to do that. If, again, you need to know the seed stock breeder and their herd very well, and you can only do that by stepping foot on their places, and preferably multiple times. But anytime we introduce what we now know, frankly, is anytime we introduce the reproductive technologies, we are at risk for negative epigenetic effects. So I would far prefer to select my bulls from animals that were naturally sired.
Okay. Thank you. Shane, here's one for you. Carl asks, how do you decide when to calve and what factors are considered?
Well, I guess, the big thing will be is when you have the most nutrition or good nutrition within your forages. That's where I would start. In our part of the world and Carl's part of the world, that's going to be, late April, starting early May. We start getting some pretty good nutritional values in those forages. And make sure, one thing also is, we also like to see those forages, that's where we like to use some stockpiled forages to save for the calving season. So we don't have too high of a protein in our grasses. We like to have some dry matter in there too. So maybe some grass we let rest from the previous summer, and we got some dead material in there, dry material. with some lush green material so those cows can balance their diets, carbon to nitrogen ratio really well. When they're calving, they're, late April, early May.
Thank you, Shane. Doug, do you want to weigh in on that? I know you've fed some different calving seasons.
Oh yeah, we calve in May, June here in Missouri and North Missouri, and then also September, October. And I will tell you that trying to determine whether to go all spring or all fall, for me has been one of the toughest decisions to make, because fescue is just not if I was on all native warm season grass, I'd be all May and June and never look back. But fescue just throws such a whole bunch of other things to think about into that mix, that it does when you add fescue and stockpiled fescue over the winter. A lot of people believe that our longest period of good quality forage, is from September all the way through, December, even January, because of the ability to stockpile that. But I would never, if I had to choose just one, it would be May, June. We would never go back to any winter calving either. There's just so many other options. So
one comment that I often hear people express about when you should calve is when do the deer fawn? When do they drop their fawns? And I think there's a reason for that. Lynn has the question. We are a mixed cattle grain operation and don't know how to grow annual crops without the use of herbicides, especially glyphosate for pre-seed burn-off as well as in-crop herbicides. Need help in remaining profitable without the use of herbicides. David?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. First and foremost, the thing about being regenerative is that it's not organic. So we're not telling farmers and ranchers that to completely eliminate the use of the synthetics, but know kind of what role they play in your operation. So, and also how frequently you're using that tool in your toolbox. The other thing would be, depending on your environment, specifically latitude in your growing season, could you allow that cover crop that's planted to grow longer and use like a roller crimper to terminate it, which would reduce the amount of herbicides that you'd have to apply, as they're going to help those cover crops will help to suppress more weeds that way. So, I mean, there's other options there. And as far as glyphosate, we look at the amount of plant species that are resistant to glyphosate, we get down to basically we're trying to control grasses and cockaburs. So we could use other, herbicides in its place. Not saying that one's better than the other there. They're all going to have some sort of an effect there as well to the soil microbiome and everything else.
I would simply add to that, Lynn, that our belief is, if you're not in organic production, it's more important for you to establish a successful cover crop. As David expressed there, I would change modes of herbicide and that, but I would not jump into just trying to grow without the herbicide, because a successful stand of diverse cover crops will provide you and the microbiology in the soil with a substantial benefit. So I don't want to see you just give that up totally until your soil is at such a state that you can, or you have used one of those other methods that David talked about. Ross asked, do you think there's an opportunity to get a grass finished endpoint sooner under irrigated high energy forages? And we have a lot of clients using irrigation. So Alan, you want to start and then pass it on?
Sure, be happy to. So Ross, first of all, I guess I would have to ask, what are you defining as a high energy forage? Are we really talking about a high vegetative state? And therefore, rather than being high energy, they're really high protein. And if that's the case, no. We're going to create a lot more issues than we create benefits. And we're also going to create the potential for all flavors in the end product. Just like grazing on non-irrigated pastures and rangeland, if we're grazing under irrigated, we need diversity and complexity in the plant species that are growing there, and we need to be grazing them when they're at least mid-stage maturity or beyond. Shane, Doug, Kent, anybody else want to chime in here?
You're absolutely right, Alan. Mid-stage maturity, definitely on those grass finishers, capture that higher energy component. Let Doug chime in here.
Well, I agree. I think the plants have to be a lot more mature than we've ever been led to believe before. And using that manure as a gauge to see where you're at, I think is just a great way to try to evaluate that forage. If you continue to watch that manure as your forage gets more mature, then you'll still be in good shape.
Okay. Philip asks, if one can't quit vaccines and wormers cold turkey, how does one step back from that? Mostly Angus, few black baldy cows, all pregnant with their second calf, located on the border of northwest New Mexico, southwest Colorado. Who wants to take a stab at that one?
Well, I'll start. Philip, I actually wrote an article on this, the 6 steps to controlling internal and external parasites in our livestock. You will find it. The primary title is Don't Let It Bug You. And then the secondary title is the 6 steps to controlling parasites in our livestock. You'll find it under our articles or blogs on our understandingag.com website. If you'll go to that article and read it, it'll pretty much outline this for you and give you the steps that you need to take to be successful at doing this.
Anyone else? Alan, there's a question from Lynn about sources of L-serine. Maybe you want to just type that in and answer that way.
I can do that.
Keep moving through this. Adam's asking a question and I'll just answer it. He's asking, where would you recommend buying a bull to start changing, excuse me, my cow herd genetics? Adam, we would have to know a lot more about where you're located. So if you'd want to reach out to Kathy, we can follow up with that. Excuse me. Okay, could you recommend a resource to learn more about responsible inline breeding practices? Alan?
Okay, I was in the middle of typing the other answer. So, all right, let me find, okay, from Madison. Yes, Madison. So I've written a number of articles, particularly dealing with line breeding and how to responsibly do this and the steps that you need to take. Be happy to share those articles with you if you'll email Kathy at Kathy with a K at understandingag.com. I'd be happy to send you these articles.
Thank you, Alan. Lauren asked, can you comment on lick tubs as a supplement? And they specifically asked about Rio nutrition tubs, which I know are all natural products. It seems to help with utilization of mature forage. Could it be producing negative effects? Doug or Shane, you care to weigh in on that one?
I'm going to allow Doug to go first, but yeah, you could be. I mean, if you're focused on your epigenetics, getting animals to, form to function, get animals that are developed that can utilize a high lignified forage. Yeah, you could have a negative effect, but you got to kind of go at this at your own pace. If you see cows that are dropping out, that are losing body score condition and stuff, sometimes you got to do what you've got to do, and definitely in the initial beginnings. If supplementation is part of that, but identify those cows that start losing the body condition soon. You might have to give them a helping hand, but those are the ones that are going to leave the operation pretty quick. The cows that can hold their condition in those high lignified forages, make sure you know who they are, and those are ones that you're going to keep within your herd.
Thank you, Shane. Doug, anything to add to that?
No, not really.
Okay. Then, Doug, I'll make you answer this one. Philip asks, how long should one keep a bull in a 2-bull herd? Is it better to keep heifer replacements and rotate bulls out, or keep a bull longer and buy replacement females?
Boy, I think Alan's the geneticist on that, but I'll tell you what I do. I keep, if a bull's a good bull, I keep him around until he goes bad. If you really look at, what's considered inbreeding, it's about the only way you can make that happen in a cow herd is if a bull calf sires, or breeds his mother, or a full brother and a full sister are really not inbreeding. It's still just 50% of their sire and mother. So as long as he's a good bull, I'm going to leave him in the herd.
Alan's nodding his head yes, and so am I. We just had a bull we got rid of that was 13 years old, and he was just good and kept, finally he was just, starting to show his age and having a harder time getting around, but he was a great bull. And why get rid of those genetics? Just take advantage of it. So I certainly agree with that. Ross asked this question. We've had good success with getting to a grass finished endpoint at 26 to 27 months on our dryland cool season grasses similar to Gabe's system. Are there operators successfully grass finishing at a younger age? Yes, Ross, there surely are, but it depends on your context and what you want to do. If I would feed haylage, for example, wean the calves earlier, I could finish ours at probably 22 to 24 months of age. But the question is, how much more expense would I have in that? And the answer would be considerable. So you have to take your context into account. Also, you take, and I'll let Alan talk about finishing in the deep south where you have a longer availability of the forages to grass finish. Alan?
Yeah, Ross, we're routinely finishing, at an earlier age, 22 to 24 months without any problem. However, that being said, we've got highly diverse diets that they're being supplied with in the pastures. So they're eating a wide array of grasses, legumes, forbs every day. and that's pretty much year round. And we, certainly the genetics and epigenetics play a key role in that. Those that are far more epigenetically adapted and fit the right phenotype are the ones that are going to finish earlier. Those that don't quite fit that phenotype are definitely taking longer.
Jay asked a good question. I'll answer that, and then I'll pass it over to Doug. When keeping bull calves at weaning, do you only keep those that look bullish, or call the ones with potential, or let the potentials grow into themselves? So, Jay, what we're doing on our ranch is we keep a large number intact at a young age. When we wean those, we want them to start showing some form of masculinity and looking like a bull. If they don't express any of that at weaning, they're 10 months of age, we'll band them then. But the majority of them we leave as bulls, and then we turn them out. Our turnout is August 5th, and we'll turn out the older bulls first. Then later in the season, we'll dump all the young ones in. Then those are left, and we really make the culling decisions on them when they're just over two years of age, because by then we really know. I know Will Harris at White Oak Pasture leaves all his bull calves intact, and he's actually harvesting them as bulls. So when they're ready at approximately 24 to 26 months of age, he will go in and make the decisions at that age, whether they will be kept as bulls or harvested as a finishing animal. Doug?
Yeah, we're pretty similar. We'll generally leave 20 or 30 of them anyway as intact bulls at weaning. And we base it on the same things you did. What's their mother like? What's the dam? What's the longevity in her life? Is the bull showing really good early maturity? And then we'll wean them, and then we'll just stick them in the bull group, and leave them in there and let them grow till they're 18 months, 2 years old, and evaluate them again. And we'll evaluate them 2 or 3 times in there. We just got done checking some bulls here the other day, some young bulls that I didn't want to keep over the winter. Normally I would have waited until spring, but we were really dry this fall and short on grass, and so I was going to eliminate anything. So we ran some young bulls through just to see how fertile they were, and so we got 4 or 5 that didn't pass the test, and they'll get banded, and I'll send them down the road here after the first of the year. So we'll evaluate them 2 or 3 times over that from weaning until 2 years old, and if anything throws its head, if anything has got a bad eye, if anything loses a tail, if it shows too much hair, we'll just run them in right then and band them, and they stay in that group, and then we'll sell them as as big yearlings. There's always folks that are looking to finish some of those big yearling calves.
Thank you. Alan, anything to add?
The only thing that I would add here is that if you can't clearly tell as a calf that they're a bull versus a heifer, then they're not a potential. Quite frankly, they need to look like a bull from an early age.
Yep. Alan, would you care to wrap up this webinar?
Well, again, we would like to thank everyone for being on this evening. We deeply appreciate it. And just one more time to remind you about 3 things. The 2 upcoming webinars, Building Resiliency, Farm and Ranch Profitability with Bert Teichert, December the 1st at 7 p.m. Central Time. And then at 7 p.m. Central Time on Thursday, December the 16th, biblical stewardship, what scripture tells us about our role as earth caretakers. And also, we will be, again, here in a few short weeks, we will be releasing our Regen Ag Adaptive Grazing online course. So once again, thank you, everybody, and we will see you next webinar.
Thank you.